My name is Carl Caldwell. I'm the director of the program in politics, law, and social thought here, or PLST, here at Rice University. I'd like to welcome you to our online event today. Professor Sanford Levinson of the University of Texas School of Law will be speaking in a few minutes here. Now, PLST, a few words on this. PLST is a combined program of the School of Humanities and the School of Social Sciences here at Rice. We would especially like to thank the Dean of Humanities and her exceptional staff for supporting this event, both financially and technically. Professor Levinson is one of the leading scholars of constitutional law in the United States. And more than that, he's one of the most original, inventive, and thought-provoking political thinkers of our time. His interventions, which I'm sure some of you have come across before, into issues of gun control, the use of torture, the ongoing expansion of presidential power, the structure of the Supreme Court, and other topics, have given evidence of his remarkable ability to unsettle political positions across the political spectrum. His provocative work of 2006, Our Undemocratic Constitution, where the Constitution goes wrong and what we the people can do to correct it, he's really good at titles, you know what he's going to argue, was, among other things, a useful broadside against the use and abuse of the myth of the US Constitution in politics. We need to couple that work, though, I think, with another book he did, and there's more books that I can begin to mention here, right? A book like his 2015, An Argument Open to All, Reading the Federalist in the 21st Century, which I particularly enjoyed. I actually agree a lot with him. When you read this book, you realize how relevant, often surprisingly relevant, Hamilton and Madison remain today. And it would be interesting if you were to update this book in light of the events of the past couple of years. Today, however, Professor Levinson is going to talk to us about a different matter, about statues and monuments, about attempts to freeze people and images of the past as part of our collective memory, while society is actually constantly in motion, constantly unfrozen, and in a democracy is in a constant process, hopefully, of self-criticism. Monuments and statues have been at the center of political debate in the United States for some decades now, but especially over the last year or so in the United States in general, in Texas, in Houston, and at Rice University. We have a diverse audience today consisting of students and faculty, alumni, and community members, which is great. And in fact, one of the great things about online presentations is that so many people can attend from so many parts of the city or parts of the United States at once. One of the drawbacks to ease of access is, however, the ease of derailing online events, indeed of derailing them with hate speech anonymously, which unfortunately has happened to some of us. For that reason, we are asking you to submit questions to us in writing. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen permitting you to do this. And I'll do my very best to present as many questions as I can to Professor Levinson. That's unfortunately the way our world is right now. Enough about organization. I would like to introduce to you Professor Sanford Levinson speaking on how should we decide who deserves public honor and memorialization in statues. Sandy?
Thank you very, very much for that certainly very flattering introduction. I want to begin, and I hope this doesn't seem too much to be advertising, but this is the cover to a book that I published, or Duke University Press published in 1998, written in stone, Public Monuments in Changing Societies. The cover, and I took the picture myself, for better or worse, the cover is literally the first thing one sees as one walks up from the south side of the Texas state capitol. It is a statue to the Confederate dead. That man standing very tall is Jefferson Davis. In the background, obviously, is the Texas state capitol. So the importance of the book in many ways is captured in the subtitle. That is Public Monuments in Changing Societies. And therefore, the first two things, quite literally, discussed in the book were the renaming of Leningrad as St. Petersburg. Remember, this came out in 1998. And secondly, what happened to a variety of statues in Budapest, Hungary, where I had the privilege and the pleasure of teaching at the Central European University over several summers. Quickly, one of the things that happens, as I've already said, is that Leningrad is no more. It is now St. Petersburg. And the statues that used to be in downtown Budapest are now, I think, about 15 kilometers outside of Budapest in a place called Statue Park. When I visited them, and this is now at least 15 or 20 years ago, actually more than 20 years ago, since we're talking about the first edition of the book, I took a bus, and you had to take a bus to Statue Park, and it's in the middle of nowhere. It is basically, or it was then, a farm. And you see in Statue Park all of these more or less grandiose statues to communist heroes, both kind of named heroes and working class heroes. And they're no longer in downtown Budapest, except for one statue that I'll mention in a moment. They're now in this middle of nowhere. They've not been destroyed, but they have certainly been removed. The one exception to that is a statue to the Soviet war dead when the Soviets liberated Budapest. It happens to be more or less in front of the American embassy, but perhaps more importantly, it is said that it rests on the graves of many Soviet soldiers who gave their lives to liberate Budapest from the Nazis. And so that particular statue remains. But the others, as I say, have been consigned, if not completely, to what Trotsky called the dustbin of history. They have been removed from their place of honor in what I call in the book sacred space. That is the space in front of the parliament, the space in a striking square in Budapest called Heroes Square, where there is a kind of unending history of monuments going down and monuments going up. But the monuments to the communist heroes that went up after World War II, replacing the former heroes of prior regimes, are no more. And I also talked about the fact that the Daniel F. Milan International Airport is no more in Cape Town, South Africa. So what should one think of that? I told people at the time that the quickest soundbite for my book was, is it Stalinist to remove statues of Stalin or to rename Leningrad? Because one of the responses that one often gets with regard to controversies about public monuments is that we shouldn't erase the past. That's what totalitarians do, whereas we liberals, and I use that word advisedly, are much more inclusive in our understanding of the past, and therefore the past should remain undisturbed, even if perhaps you put up brand new monuments to accompany the past monuments. So what about taking down statues of Lenin or Stalin? What about changing the names of cities? There's one interesting difference between name changes and taking down statues. Statues are physical objects. They occupy a certain space. And as you at Rice especially know, but quite frankly, there's nothing exceptional about Rice. One of the realities of this topic, once one gets hooked on it, is that you discover that there are examples almost literally everywhere about whether statues should stay up or come down. And the controversy at Rice is, of course, the statue of William Marsh Rice. And I gather there are those who would either move the statue somewhere else or who would simply take down the statue and consign it to absolute oblivion. What interests me, quite frankly, is whether anybody is suggesting renaming Rice University, because after all, what more honors somebody, let's call him Vladimir Lenin, than naming the second most important city, and some people would say the most important city in what used to be the Soviet Union, after one of the great founders of the Soviet Union. You can't merely move a building or move a name. You have to change those things. So, for example, King's College in New York no longer exists except under the name of Columbia University, which changed, not surprisingly, after what most people call the American Revolution, and I increasingly insist is the American secession from the British Empire. But the point is that one of the first things the so-called patriots, that is, the patriots from our point of view, though they were certainly traitors from the British point of view, one of the first things they did was to destroy the statue of His Royal Majesty King George III in what is now downtown New York, and turn it into bullets to use against the redcoats. A wonderful sort of played out metaphor of this whole problem. And of course, by 1776, New York was New York, not New Amsterdam, and that could be the topic of a separate lecture. So this is the first edition, 1998. This is the second edition, the 20th anniversary edition that came out in 2018. As you will note, the covers are very, very different. The cover in front of the Texas Capitol, which incidentally could still be used because the statue is still there, captured a reality about Texas political culture that I thought was worth discussing. And this seemed to be a natural picture for the cover. This is New Orleans in about 2017, following a decision by the New Orleans City Council, but much more significantly in some way, a truly great speech by Mitch Landrieu, then the mayor of New Orleans, explaining why it was time to take Robert E. Lee down from Lee Circle, and along the way, change the name of Lee Circle. Because in a very important sense, I would argue that this was the final signal of regime change in New Orleans that you might argue was thought to begin in 1865, but quite frankly, it didn't take. That there was a Reconstruction government in Louisiana and in New Orleans, but it was, of course, replaced during so-called Reconstruction. And I say so-called because if you view Reconstruction as a process of significant regime change, then there's very good reason to argue that what we often call the first Reconstruction failed. We can debate about the date of failure, whether it was 1877, 1888, 1890, the turn of the century, but there can be little doubt that if your aim was truly significant regime change, it didn't work. The best evidence that it didn't work for my purposes, and I have pictures and I discuss this at length, both in the original and revised editions, is the monument to what I always point out is the aptly named White League that used to be at the foot of Canal Street in New Orleans. It was put up in 1891, and it memorialized the brave white folks in the White League who killed a bunch of municipal police in order, as the statue indicated, to try to restore, quote, our government back to its rightful owners. It didn't work in 1873, but by 1877 and certainly by 1891, it was successful. And that's why you get the monument in 1891. The monument doesn't go up in 1873 or even in 1877. It takes a while. Similarly, this monument to Jefferson Davis and the Confederate war dead goes up ultimately in 1903. It is dedicated by two Texas governors, one of them a veteran of the Confederacy, the other who points out that he's an ardent devotee of the lost cause theory of the war. And so he is pleased as punch to accept this statue in the name of the people of Texas. And of course, one of the topics is who exactly count as the people of Texas. And we all know who the answer is, politically speaking. The people, the white people of Texas, the unreconstructed people of Texas were delighted to accept this monument. And you should know that it's one of three monuments to the Confederate war dead on the grounds of the Texas Capitol. There is no monument, for example, to George Armstrong Custer, who, before gaining eternal fame or infamy at Little Bighorn, was actually the general in charge of what some people thought was the liberation of Austin. That is not memorialized on the Texas Capitol grounds, but there are certainly multiple memorials to the Confederate soldiers. So I am interested in how it is simply analytically that the taking down of monuments or the putting up of new monuments is simply a way objectively and analytically to locate regime change. So that one might argue that for all of the obvious changes in Texas politics, even during the time I have lived in Texas, which is now for 40 years, there have clearly been many significant political changes. And it would be foolish beyond belief to say that these changes are not significant. It is important, for example, that there is a quite impressive statue about the history of Texas African Americans that now shares the sacred space of the Texas Capitol grounds. On the other hand, this monument is still there, and I would be willing to argue analytically that so long as it remains, then the degree of regime change in Texas regarding debates going back literally to 1865 and the meaning of the war and the meaning of Reconstruction, that the regime change is incomplete. Thus, I would also argue that it is significant that Princeton University, after significant discussion and with great debate, simply changed the name of what had been one of its crown jewels, that is the Woodrow Wilson School of International Affairs. And they did so not because they repudiated Woodrow Wilson's having won the Nobel Peace Prize, but because he was almost certainly the most racist president at least with regard to the treatment of African Americans, the most racist president since Andrew Johnson. Um, Interestingly enough, and this touches on some of the issues that I'll get to in a few moments, um, Wilson had a mixed record with regard to his bigotry. It was during his presidency of Princeton that Catholics and Jews were first appointed to the faculty at Princeton. He appointed the first Jew to the US Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis. So he was a thoroughgoing racist who inflicted great damage on the United States. But in certain other respects, he was forward looking. And that is part of the complexity of knowing what to do with Wilson. It's also the case of Wilson at Princeton, as is true of Rice at Rice, or James Buchanan Duke at the school that I went to as an undergraduate, or Leland Stanford at the school I went to get a law degree, that you can't possibly understand the history of the institutions without paying some attention to Buck Duke and Rice and Leland Stanford. But what about John C. Calhoun? And I mentioned Calhoun not with regard to Lake Calhoun in South Carolina, but rather Calhoun College at Yale. That was named in 1931 when Yale created its college system and wanted to hire various Yale notables, among them being Jonathan Edwards, among them being Samuel F.B. Morse, and among them being John Calhoun. There were obviously others as well. Well, in 1931, Calhoun was notable to most people at Yale, primarily as an alum who made very good. He graduated in 1802 from Yale. Very shortly thereafter, he became a representative, Secretary of War, Secretary of State, Vice President under two different presidents, and one of the most important senators in the history of the United States. So why not name a college after this illustrious alum, who in fact was given an honorary degree from Yale in 1822? Well, the answer is rather obvious. John C. Calhoun is the architect of nullification, which, with only slight tweaks, turns him into the architect of secession. But in both cases, what really motivated him was his belief that slavery was a positive good, that Blacks were inferior, and that it would simply be shocking and wrong to do anything that would generate impediments to the flourishing of slavery in the United States. So by 2016, 2017, it no longer is sufficient to say that John C. Calhoun was an illustrious alum of Yale. And they renamed the college. But one of the reasons I suggest that it was relatively easy to rename the college is precisely that you can understand the history of Yale University quite easily without ever mentioning John C. Calhoun. Unlike Woodrow Wilson at Yale or Rice at Rice, they are central to the history, whether it is, as with James Buchanan Duke, supplying a whole lot of money that made it possible to construct a great university, and both Duke and Rice are great universities, Or in the case of Wilson, he didn't have money to build Princeton. Rather, he was an extraordinarily important president of Princeton, and nobody could understand Princeton without paying attention to Wilson. So how does one take that into account? So before I go into the full body of my comments, I want to offer two quotations. One is from Joseph Schumpeter, very eminent economist, who is very, very famous for his reference to, quote, creative destruction, unquote, as part of capitalism. What capitalism just means is that the buggy whip industry will be supplanted by the new industry producing internal combustion cars. ExxonMobil, which people in Houston have great reason to be very familiar with, may in fact go the way of the buggy whip industry, not completely, obviously, because we're going to continue to need oil. But to the extent that oil has a symbiotic relationship with the automobile industry, then our grandchildren and perhaps even our children are going to be experiencing a very different world where to drive a car will not require oil. And for Schumpeter, that's creative destruction. So I borrow this metaphor with regard to the culture of the market of culture. How is it that there is destruction, creative or not, when one regime replaces another? This goes all the way back to ancient times, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the taking down of ancient monuments and the replacement by new monuments. There is nothing new under the sun with regard to the destruction of sacred space. Indeed, especially sacred space may be subject to destruction, as, for example, Christians take over space from Muslims, or Muslims might take over space from Christians. So that is the first very short quotation. When do we honor destruction and call it creative, or at least understandable or tolerable? And when do we denounce it as barbarian, such as, for example, the acts of the Taliban in destroying wonderful Buddhist monuments from about 1,000 years ago? That was almost universally condemned, but exactly why? The second quote is a bit longer. David Reef, from a very interesting book called In Praise of Forgetting. It is not coincidental that Reef wrote this book after spending several years in the South Balkans and becoming quite intimately familiar with the culture of the South Balkans and Kosovo, Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the like. So Reef writes, quote, "We have entered a world in which the essential function of collective memory is one of legitimizing a particular world and political and social agenda, and delegitimizing those of one's ideological opponents." I think he's absolutely right, that the original function, and I use function advisedly, purpose and function of the Washington Monument, let us say, was to create a single collective memory that all Americans could unite around, that if George Washington is not the hero of each and every one of us, then who would be? And it allows the telling of a story to our children, to immigrants, These are the individuals we honor. We honor them with place names: Washington, D.C., Houston, Texas, Austin, Texas. We honor them with statues. We honor them with endless hagiographic biographies. And this is the way we create a single collective identity. What Reef is suggesting, I believe, is that in the modern world, that is the one we live in today, the idea of a collective identity is in shatters. That we are all aware that we live in highly pluralized worlds, where to speak naively of a we the people, or to speak, as the Declaration of Independence does, of one people who are coming together to secede from the British Empire, that doesn't make any sense. If you're an historian, you know that it didn't make any sense in 1776 or in 1787, as a number of people even pointed at the time, and any halfway competent historian would point out today. There were significant differences among the people who lived in Massachusetts and Virginia and Georgia. Some of this with regard to the way they organized their economy, that is, the use of slaves or free labor. Some of it having to do with whether they were Presbyterians or Congregationalists, Baptists, Episcopalians, or other. Some of it having to do with what languages they spoke. A third of the people living in Pennsylvania spoke German. The US Constitution was translated into German and Dutch within a month after its signing in September of 1787, because of the third of Pennsylvanians who spoke German, and the fact that just north of Manhattan, there was a large and substantial and important group of New Yorkers who spoke Dutch, thus the original name of New Amsterdam. I originally became familiar with Carl Caldwell's work because of his interest in thought of Weimar Germany of the 20s and the brooding omnipresence over anybody interested in Weimar Germany is Carl Schmitt, a demonically brilliant jurisprudential theorist. He is demonic because he ended up as an apologist for the Nazi takeover in the 30s. His most important and quite brilliant book, Constitutional Theory, is predicated on the notion that underlying the German constitutional order is ein Volk, one people. One could say that underlines the United States Constitution, that with regard to this evocation of popular sovereignty and a singular people, there was nothing exceptional about Schmitt. What makes him exceptional and demonic is that he applied that theory to justifying the takeover of Germany by the National Socialist Party and its own view that they represented the ein Volk of Germany. And we know where that led to. So all of us today, regardless of our politics, left, right, or center, I think are wrestling with the reality of pluralism and the degree to which one can create a common public narrative once one recognizes the reality of pluralism. It's not merely that one person's terrorist may be another person's freedom fighter, but that one person's hero or one group's hero may be another group's villain. So I'm particularly interested, for example, in the different names of what is now the Little Bighorn National Monument. Not surprisingly, it began as the George Armstrong Custer National Monument, memorializing the massacre of the brave American soldiers by the savage Sioux. And I use that term advisedly because you can find Supreme Court opinions and a lot of other public writings of the time who dismissed Native Americans as savages, who had to be displaced or killed if they offered resistance to the American takeover of the American West. Today, that is no longer acceptable. So the name is the Little Bighorn National Monument. And what is really, really interesting is that there are statues not only to Custer, but also to the Sioux, and what really disrupts the narrative, to the Crows, who were collaborators with Custer against the Sioux, because it is naive sentimentalism to believe that all of the roughly 500 Native American nations were necessarily friendly with one another and were not engaged quite often in quite bloody wars with one another. But how do we come to terms with this? Is there a way of deciding when it is proper to rename Leningrad, to take down a statue of Joseph Stalin, to burn a statue of George III, or rather to keep them up because we wish to honor the complexity of our past? So let me say, partly because of pressures of time, that I do not believe there's an algorithm that will tell us when it is proper to take down the statues and when we ought to leave them up. A professional obsession of lawyers and at least some philosophers is to come up with general, abstract, neutral principles that will tell us when we can do these things. Why is it all right, for example, to strip the name of a great philanthropist named Bill Cosby from a number of programs that he endowed, because we now know that he was also a serial sexual predator? I find that an interesting question. I do not mean to be arguing that it is not proper to strip the name of Bill Cosby from a variety of programs honoring him, but I do think it's a complicated question, and I do not believe that there is any singular answer to it. So now I come to the second part of the title of my talk, and I anticipate that some of the questions afterward may address the issue of whether there is a principle that will allow us to say with confidence that Rice's statue should stay up or come down. But let me turn to the question of who ought to make that decision. And so, quite obviously, I am very interested in the fact that there is a committee of people at Rice, just as was true at Princeton, just as was true at Yale, just as was true at the Harvard Law School, when there was a very surprisingly bitter controversy about the shield of the Harvard Law School, which did not directly honor the royal Royall family that had helped to endow the Harvard Law School, but it was in fact incorporating part of the shield of the royal family. And you will not be surprised to learn that the royal family got the money that it could use to help endow the Harvard Law School from its slave plantation in Jamaica. That fact was basically unknown until the beginning of the 21st century, when a very scholarly history of the Harvard Law School uncovered this information. And then, for whatever reason, this became very, very important to a group of students at the Harvard Law School about 2015. And of course, a committee was appointed. But then the next question is, hey, what does the committee do? First of all, we know that the committee needs to be, quote, inclusive and diverse. And we can have a long conversation about how you know whether committees are sufficiently inclusive and diverse. But you also know that one of the things that any committee has to do is to survey and take the pulse of those people who, in contemporary lingo, are the stakeholders, whether we're talking about Rice, Duke, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, New York City, ad infinitum. So, I'm very interested in discovering from my recent readings of the Rice Thresher that there is a survey that is going out. And just reading from the Thresher, the survey asked if the statue of William Marsh Rice should be removed from the academic quad, and asked how they reached their answer. The task force also set surveys concerning the statue directly to Rice alumni, staff, and faculty. And it clarified that no decision had been made or presumably would be made until all of these groups had been heard from. At Yale, incidentally, there was an attempt also to poll the views of people who worked for Yale, a disproportionate number of whom, of course, were African American, as I suspect is the case at Rice, as I suspect is the case at Duke, and also people from New Haven, who also were viewed as having some stake. Well, the obvious question is, what should the committee do when it discovers, or if it discovers, as I suspect will be more or less the case, that contemporary students, that is the future alums, might have a different view of the matter from people who graduated from Rice 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, which is not to say, incidentally, that the students will necessarily be united or that the alums will necessarily be united. One of the things I read was a very interesting opinions piece in the Thresher by a recent graduate named Jacob Saudinger, who argued quite eloquently for keeping the statue up. Whereas I presume that most of the students who have been actively involved in this have argued for removing the statue. But you have not only predictable differences of opinion between alumni and recent graduates or present students, but I suspect between faculty and students and alums. And the faculty views would certainly not be united. It would shock me if there's not at least one member of the history faculty who takes the general view that you should never, ever remove anything that now exists, because that is to desecrate what history is about. It would also surprise me if there's not at least one member of the history department who would say that it is time for the statue to go, and maybe even time for the name of Rice to be reconsidered. So I don't want to argue that there is necessarily a community of students or a community of faculty or a community of alums, all of whom think alike. The obvious and difficult problem is that the more we study any alleged community, the more we discover how pluralized it is. So then the question is not only, well, are there general theories that will inform us and allow us to generate a kind of peace and goodwill among all of us when we decide, or when you decide, whether or not the statue remains or is moved. But can we even agree exactly on the process of decision? Should the decision be made by the president of Rice, as was true at Princeton and at Yale? Ultimately, there were advisory committees, but it was the presidents who took responsibility for the decision, as was the case at the University of Texas when the statue of Jefferson Davis on the UT grounds was removed. The then president wrote a note explaining his decision. Or should the decision be made by the committee? Or should the decision be made by a vote of everybody in the Rice community, a referendum? All of these are possibilities. All of these might well lead to different outcomes. And is there a neutral way of deciding what the process should be? And once again, my answer may be rather discouraging. I don't think there is a neutral process that will make everybody happy with an outcome. So we really are faced with an essential political problem. How do we resolve deep questions of political conflict where we do disagree, as David Reef suggests, on a number of very important ideological issues, and this disagreement spills over even to agreeing as to a method or a process of resolving them? I suspect I have said enough to generate some questions. I'm obviously fascinated in the subject. I have talked to my editor at Duke about the possibility of a 25th anniversary edition, because it turns out to be the case that this general issue just does not go away. And almost literally every day will generate new examples of this general problem.
Thank you very much. This was certainly an exciting discussion, and I know that some of the questions that are coming in are related directly to some of your discussions about accepting pluralism and some of the ramifications of that. So let me jump to one right now, which is actually sent in before your talk began. And I'll comment a little bit on the question too, but I think the author is aiming at: how does relocation of a memorializing statue change its status or meaning, right? Because the place really matters here. And then the second part, and who then owns the conversation? I'm especially interested in that second part because the relocation also is not neutral. What happens when, if say, Rice's statue were to be moved, what would be the implications?
Right. This is why I'm interested in the notion of sacred space, that there is simply a symbolic, a phenomenological difference between the grounds of the state capitol and a state museum. One of the things that so interests me about Statue Park in Budapest is that the first thing that a viewer realizes is that the statues have, the meaning of the statues just have changed if they're no longer in downtown Budapest and are now symbolically in the middle of nowhere. So that's one answer. The second answer is who owns the conversation. And I don't have a good answer to that, because that is what the political fight is about. Is the conversation owned by the people who made these decisions in 1903 when this statue goes up? Is it owned by the present Texas legislature, which, if this were a different sort of lecture, we could talk about how representative the Texas legislature is of the 26 million people who live in Texas today? Is it owned by the people who feel offended by having to see, every time they wish to enter the state capitol, this memorialization of Jefferson Davis? Mitch Landrieu, in his speech that concludes my second edition of the book, and which I consider to be one of the truly great political speeches of my lifetime, talks about the degree to which no citizen of New Orleans should feel affronted when going by the great public spaces of New Orleans. Now, if you visit a museum of the city of New Orleans, you have no right not to be affronted if the museum reminds you of uncomfortable facts about New Orleans or Texas history. But with regard to public space, the purpose is not educational in the same way that a museum might be educational. Rather, it is to form a certain kind of civic consciousness. So, quite frankly, those of you who know New Orleans know that one of the great public spaces is Jackson Square. And so I cannot help but be curious what the long-term fate of Andrew Jackson in New Orleans will be, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. We know that Andrew Jackson is slated to disappear from the $20 bill to be replaced by Harriet Tubman. So who owns the past, and who owns the depiction of the past in public space, is one of the things that politics is just about. And it's, Oliver Wendell Holmes said, we live by symbols and we die by symbols. And one of the problems with symbolic politics, as opposed to a lot of ordinary politics, is that we can't simply split the difference. You want to spend $100 million, I'm going to spend $50 million, we agree on $75 million. It's much harder to know how to compromise if you want to keep up the statue of Jefferson Davis, or if you want to keep the name of John C. Calhoun College, and I want to erase it.
Thank you. We have actually a lot of these questions are revolving around the issues you're bringing up about pluralism and controversy. I have a fairly straightforward question here, which reminds me of Barcelona, for good or bad. Does historical memory require statues? I'm thinking of Barcelona because post-Franco, what was the statue of the politician of the 20th century who would be represented in Barcelona? I mean, it was a little unclear. We have now nationalist statues coming up, but that was not a scientific study, just from walking around Barcelona. But the question is, does historical meaning even require statues?
Well, it's a wonderful question. I would assert that I'm just not familiar with any political culture that hasn't used statues as a way of forming a civic consciousness. I had the opportunity now, about 35 years ago, to visit Luxor in Egypt, the great pharaonic statues. There might have been some religious purposes to these immense statues, but I also suspect that one of their purposes and functions was to reinforce the legitimacy and power of the pharaohs. That's just what new regimes do. Out with the old, in with the new. So one of the things I talk about in the second edition to the book is the removal of Francisco Franco's body from the Valley of the Fallen, which basically was a Francoist attempt to honor one side of the Spanish Civil War. When Franco died and Spain changed in 1976, 1978, not surprisingly, public space changed, and Franco's body was removed from the Valley of the Fallen and given a burial in a more private site. They didn't burn the body, but it was, if you will, privatized. Not surprisingly, there were Francoists who objected to this, who continued to view Franco as a hero of the Spanish people. But I think it's fair to say that by today, most people view Franco as a villain rather than a hero, but it's still a subject of debate. It will be interesting to see what future monuments are like in the United States. One of my favorite factoids is that there are fewer and fewer public schools named after presidents of the United States because presidents have become too controversial. The most common name for new high schools in Florida is Manatee. Who doesn't love these ungainly fish/mammals? So, but to name a public school after the noted Florida resident Donald J. Trump, I suspect would generate a whole lot of controversy, and it's not likely to happen in the foreseeable future.
Thank you. I've got a couple questions, which I'm sure you thought about. They're both revolving around the issue of the founding fathers and how you commemorate them, and of course, whether you commemorate them. We've heard these debates not only about Washington, but also about Jefferson and others. So both questions, I'll read them both. What are your thoughts regarding dual acknowledgements documenting both sides of a historical figure, that is the founding fathers? And similarly, in cases such as those of Washington and Jefferson, how do you balance the laudable and objectionable within their legacy? The difference between the two, the second one is asking you how to balance. The first one is asking you how to represent, which is the interesting problem. Of a statue, you're representing singularly. How do you represent complexity?
Right. Again, both are very good questions. I mean, what if the Jefferson Memorial, the memorial to Jefferson stayed up, but what if the statue showed him putting his leg on the neck of a slave? I suspect there would be a lot of controversy about that. Indeed, there was a lot of controversy about the statue to Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C. There was a current controversy, even as we speak, about a statue that portrays Lincoln as emancipating a slave who was on his knee and who is gratefully receiving his freedom from the great emancipator. Well, this conflicts with what is now sometimes referred to as the theory or myth of the white savior, that denies the extent to which emancipation was in some very profound sense self-emancipation, and that Lincoln in his own way had to be dragged kicking and screaming toward the radicalism of the Emancipation Proclamation. And for that matter, as every historian knows, the Emancipation Proclamation emancipated as a legal matter no slave in the 4 loyal states, that is Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, where slavery remained legal. And it didn't even emancipate any slaves in New Orleans, because New Orleans had been reconquered by federal troops and was no longer subject. So, frankly, I don't have a good answer to the question of how one in a single monument would capture that complexity. The FDR monument in Washington does not include space for Presidential Order 9066 and the incarceration, the detention of 120,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese resident aliens in what are correctly called concentration camps. You know, I do find interesting Little Bighorn, but there you have competing monuments. You don't have a single monument that captures this complexity. The second part of your question is the balancing problem. What do we recognize? How do we recognize the good and the evil? So let me simply refer to a paragraph from this very well-written essay by, I think he's a graduate of Rice in 2016, Jacob Saldinger, who writes, Rice did own slaves. He did participate in the slave trade and promoted segregation by endowing a university to educate only white students. His contributions to the institutions of slavery and segregation are disgraceful, and a greater awareness of them is good. Nonetheless, calls to remove his statue are problematic and should be rejected. They present a false view that we should not commemorate a historical figure who has made valuable contributions to society because this person had moral flaws. We shouldn't minimize the moral flaws, but we shouldn't allow the moral flaws to dominate. And then, not surprisingly, in the very next paragraph, he evokes Sam Houston, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln, and asks, where does it stop? So I refer to these two different strategies, and I don't mean this to be snarky or necessarily critical, but I do mean to say that they're rhetorical strategies. The first strategy is what we might call to err is human. Yes, Rice had his flaws, but they ought to be counterbalanced by the fact that he did some great things, one of which was making possible Rice University. So here's where I would evoke Bill Cosby. In all seriousness, we now know that America's dad had great, great flaws. He's in jail right now. Should that automatically wipe out the good deeds that he did? I do not view this as a knockdown argument. This is something we really have to confront. But it does seem to me that it is an understandable rhetorical strategy where you concede that the person is imperfect, indeed radically imperfect. You then say to err is human, and then say, look at the good that this person did. The second strategy is the slippery slope problem, where slippery slope arguments have a very interesting structure, because if you take them seriously, they really do more or less concede that the specific thing you're arguing is quite defensible. But then you go on to say, but look, most people are not going to be as careful and refined as you are. Most people are going to use this as a precedent for many other things that I don't really believe you want to endorse, like taking down the statues of Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, etc. So what we have to do is head this off at the pass. The way we avoid going down the route of having to wrestle with, hey, what about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, is to say, let's avoid the fact that Rice owned slaves, or fill in the blank with other much less well-known. Rice is an essential figure at Rice University. Most people in the country have never heard of William Marsh Rice. They don't really care whether the statue goes up or not. They do care about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln. But the argument is, let's not go down that route. So therefore, let's keep Rice up. At the end of the day, I don't think that either strategy is going to be completely successful, because we can always argue about what aspects of a particular figure's biography will dominate other aspects, whether we're talking about Rice or Thomas Jefferson or Bill Cosby, Franklin Roosevelt, ad infinitum, Carl Schmitt, a really brilliant jurisprudent political theorist who unfortunately was a Nazi collaborator. And nobody suggests naming a program after Carl Schmitt for good reasons. But I think that Carl will agree with me that he was really very, very brilliant, and that you really can't understand 20th century and even 21st century jurisprudence without encountering Schmitt. But I don't want to build a monument to him.
Good. Actually, there is kind of a monument to him at his old house, but we can't get into there. People talk about ghost stories there. I have a question from a former graduate student in history who has been thinking about the monument issue for some years and lately has been teaching about the monument issue. And he writes, it's a little complicated question here. I like the idea of statue removal and dedication as a sign of regime change, but I wonder if that is true for the Confederate statue removals post-2016. Many of them, especially those illicitly removed by protesters, seem more calls for regime change than reflections of it. Even when removed by city officials, some of these removals can seem like empty gestures in cities where social inequities continue to exist. Should we think of these recent removals as more aspirational or as actual symbols of change?
That is a great, great question. And what it does is to point to the complexity of the term regime change itself, that regime changes don't take place overnight. We can speak of failed efforts at regime change. I mean, take the so-called Arab Spring in Egypt in particular. There was great optimism in 2011 and 2012 that there would be genuine regime change. Mubarak was displaced. He was even thrown in jail. There was a quite free election that elected somebody from the Muslim Brotherhood who was overthrown 1 or 2 years later. Currently, Egypt is ruled by somebody who, if anything, is probably more dictatorial than Hosni Mubarak. And I think most people would say some version of the more things appear to change, the more they stay the same. So that you would write a book about failed regime change, but certainly, at least as of right now, not about successful regime change. I think that would be the history of Reconstruction, that in 1871, in 1873, you might say, look, regime change doesn't take place overnight, but there are some very encouraging indices that regime change will take place. There were Black senators and representatives in the United States Congress. There were Black members of the Mississippi State Legislature. And there's actually a remarkable book by John Roy Lynch, who was one of the Black legislators, who wrote a book called The Facts of Reconstruction in 1911, remarkably enough. But the brunt of the book was that he and many other African Americans were quite optimistic that Reconstruction would take. He believed that the planter class would accept a new reality and that there would be a new day dawning. Didn't work out that way. And we can debate, as I suggested earlier, exactly when it didn't work out. So what I would say is that the removal of the statues is a sign of incipient regime change. Like many other people, I find myself watching a number of television programs dealing with civil rights history, a multi-program series on Aretha Franklin, and there's a reference to the song "Change Is a Coming," or to Marvin Gaye, "What's Going On." One can think of Buffalo Springfield. Stop, listen, what's going on? And I am old enough now to read books of history on the 1960s that I experienced very much as part of my own becoming a fully formed adult. So will it be the case in 2040 that we will see these statues coming down, these renamings, as evidence of a more genuine regime change? I mean, we can think of debates 10 years ago. Was Barack Obama's election the sign of our becoming a post-racial America, where we really were resolving once and for all a history of white supremacy? Because after all, how could a country committed to white supremacy elect Barack Obama to be president of the United States? All of us know of those debates. I suspect that we participated in them. And today, that story appears more naive and more optimistic than was justified, especially given the Trump presidency and what the Republican Party has truly become as a result of the Trump presidency. But, this is why history is so fascinating, that we can predict the past, but we're very poor at predicting the future.
Great. I have one more question I'd like to ask, which is going to shift gears a little bit. I promise we won't keep you too long, Sandy. It actually has to do with the relationship between memorials and art. Do the artists who originally fashioned these statues or their descendants have any say in these decisions, and should they?
Another great question. There are controversies in San Francisco and Lexington, Kentucky, in particular, about murals that were painted in the 1930s as part of the public work, the WPA, Works Product. I now forget the actual words, but a lot of artists were given commissions to paint murals. In fact, my wife is literally just about to publish a book on Ben Shahn, a great artist of the 30s and thereafter who painted murals in Roosevelt, New Jersey, in a New York post office and elsewhere on social justice. Well, there's this monument, there's this mural in San Francisco that includes, among other things, a dead Native American and I believe a slave. In Lexington, Kentucky, I'm absolutely positive that the mural includes a submissive Native American, I think actually a dead Native American, and slaves picking cotton in the cotton fields in Kentucky. In both of these localities, there were protests that the murals should be erased because they are offensive to at least some of the students, and I presume some of the teachers who teach in the San Francisco school and at the University of Kentucky. In fact, the San Francisco School Board actually passed a resolution calling for the erasure of the mural, and it generated a literally nationwide protest by artists who were saying that this is actually a work of art, and to erase it is to commit a crime against aesthetics in a way that to destroy a pharaonic monument. Look, the pharaonic monuments are memorializing tyrants. None of them deserve to be memorialized in terms of our values 4,000 years later. But what we would say, presumably, is that these are incredibly important aesthetic objects that deserve to be retained, as would be true of portraits by Velázquez and other 16th and 17th century painters of very, very unattractive people. I don't know if there were any German artists who painted portraits of Hitler in the 30s. My hunch is that the answer is no, because the Nazis were vehemently opposed to modernism in art, and the good artists were all modernists. But what if by stipulation there had been a great portrait painter who painted a portrait of Hitler in 1936? Would you in fact refuse to hang it in a German National Museum? In Lexington, Kentucky, the decision was made to put this mural behind drapes, so that I actually gave a talk at the University of Kentucky in November of 2019. I adverted to this mural. There was a talk by someone else about the mural, but we could not walk next door to see the mural because it is behind drapes. Contrast this with many of the Civil War monuments to Confederate soldiers. Donald Trump is perhaps the only person in America who is willing to say that the typical Civil War statue is, quote, beautiful, unquote. Most of these statues, as every historian knows, were mass produced and do not represent any significant moment in American aesthetics. That is not true of every single one of the statues. No doubt there are some statues that were produced by eminent sculptors that present the aesthetic problem that you are referring to. At the University of Texas, for example, Littlefield Fountain was created by a sculptor named Coloni, who was a person of some genuine stature. And so it raises an interesting question about what you do with this monument that was designed to honor the Confederacy because Colonel Littlefield was a colonel in the Confederate Army and never gave up his commitment to the lost cause notion of the war. Once again, I don't have an algorithm to answer that very, very good question. People who are artists incline to be formalists and will say, look, you don't have to be a devotee of the Spanish monarchy of the 17th century in order to realize that Velázquez was one of the giants of Western painting. And the portraits he did of these dreadful people should remain objects of study and even veneration. You don't have to be a Christian in order to think that endless portraits of the Madonna and Child or of San Sebastian with the arrows should remain up because they're done by great artists who were in fact Christians and who no doubt were devotees of a theology that their portraits were designed to serve. But today, if we see them at the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, you don't see them most of the time as a believing Christian or devotee of the Spanish monarchy. You see them as somebody interested in art history. And it's a very different phenomenological experience. I don't know if this is helpful or not. I suspect not at the end of the day.
I think these are great questions, and the only way we can get forward on these kinds of issues is to raise the hard questions. I remarked at the beginning on Professor Levinson's remarkable ability to unsettle political positions across the political spectrum. I hope he has delivered today. My feeling is that he has. So I would like to thank you, Professor Levinson, for coming, and I hope that you can come back to Rice, virtually or otherwise, at some point soon.
Well, the thanks are mine. And my wife and I actually visited Houston a couple of weeks ago. I fell in love with the city and would gladly come back under any circumstances.
Wonderful. So thank you very much. I would like to mention an event that's happening tomorrow night, sponsored by the Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Injustice here at Rice. It's entitled A Segregated Houston, Black Life Beyond the Hedges, and starts tomorrow at 6 p.m. Again, you can find this on the webpage of the Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Justice. I would like to thank everybody for coming, and especially Professor Levinson, and I wish you all a good evening.